Hello and welcome to Petroleum's Industrialization, Catalyst for Environmental Awakening. I'm your host, Kellen Heptich. Today, we embark on a journey through history to examine how the industrialization of petroleum has shaped environmental consciousness, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. Let us begin by delving into the historical backdrop of petroleum's industrialization. In 1859, Edwin Drake's groundbreaking drilling of the first commercial oil well in Titsville, Pennsylvania, sparked the advent of the modern petroleum industry. By the close of 1859, a barrel of petroleum fetched $20. Yet, as production surged, prices plummeted to $9.60 in 1860 and an astonishing 49 cents per barrel in 1861. With burgeoning demand and the rise of titans like John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, the market underwent rapid industrialization. To grasp the magnitude of this industrial expansion, we turn to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration spanning the early 20th to 21st centuries. As depicted in the U.S. field production of oil graph, monthly oil production in the U.S. surged from approximately 1.1 million barrels in January of 1920 to a staggering 9,478,000 barrels by January of 1970. These figures vividly illustrate the exponential growth of the petroleum industry within the United States during this period. Additionally, the U.S. Energy Information Administration offers an interactive map showcasing industrial sites for oil production and refining. This visual representation underscores the pervasive proliferation of such facilities in the modern era, further exemplifying the industry's remarkable expansion over the past century and a half. However, this rapid industrialization was not without its consequences. The environmental ramifications of petroleum extraction, refining, and consumption became increasingly apparent, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. The proliferation of oil infrastructure, coupled with heightened industrial demand, amplified the frequency and severity of environmental disasters, most notably oil spills. Oil spills inflict catastrophic harm upon ecosystems, contaminating waterways, jeopardizing marine life, and undermining ecological balance. The noxious constituents of crude oil persist in the environment, causing enduring disruptions to food chains and habitats. Marine fauna suffer respiratory ailments and buoyancy impairment, while oil-laden coastlines witness declines in biodiversity and habitat degradation. On land, oil spills smother soil and vegetation, impeding plant growth and disrupting terrestrial ecosystems. The resultant soil contamination poses long-term hazards to agricultural productivity and ecosystem health, endangering both human and wildlife populations through the ingestion of contaminated resources. One significant illustration of the toll exacted by industrial pollution is the Love Canal disaster of 1977. Originating from toxic chemicals seeping from a waste disposal site into residential areas, this tragedy underscored the profound human and environmental consequences of unchecked pollution. The New York Department of Public Health's report classifying the affected area as an extreme threat to life stands as a stark testament to the enduring impacts of industrial negligence on public health and environmental integrity. Local communities galvanized in response to such environmental injustices, as evidenced by the images from the Bettman Collection. The Bettman Collection chronicles their steadfast advocacy for remediation and accountability in the face of corporate and governmental apathy. Let's further contextualize the societal response to environmental disasters by examining the protests following the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969. This catastrophic event, triggered by a blowout of an offshore drilling rig, unleashed thousands of barrels of crude oil into the pristine waters off the California coast. In the wake of this ecological catastrophe, outraged citizens, environmental activists, and concerned residents took to the streets in protest, decrying the lax regulatory oversight and corporate negligence that precipitated the spill. The images from the Bettman Collection and the UC Santa Barbara archives vividly depict the sense of urgency and determination among protesters, echoing their demands for stricter environmental regulations and accountability for oil companies. For deeper insight, let us consider the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Occurring when the Exxon Valdez tanker ran aground in Alaska's Prince William Sound, this calamity disgorged an estimated 11 million gallons of oil. The subsequent report to the president illuminated the environmental and socioeconomic devastation wrought by the spill, prompting calls for enhanced regulatory oversight and environmental safeguards. Moreover, the inadequacies of prevailing safety protocols and emergency response mechanisms were laid bare, catalyzing public outcry and prompting demands for policy reform and corporate accountability. This is evidenced by the archival imagery from Alaska's Digital Archive depicting protests and calls for justice. EPA reports on oil and gas disasters offer invaluable insights into the pervasive impacts of industrial pollution on the environment and public health. These government records meticulously document major incidents necessitating regulatory intervention, underscoring the systematic risk posed by industry malpractice and the imperative for robust environmental protections. Between 1982 and 1987, the EPA reported 309 major violations of the established regulatory policies, each of which requiring either state or federal action. This exemplifies the frequency of oil pollution even with all of these improved regulations. As awareness of petroleum's environmental footprint burgeoned, so too did the momentum of the environmental movements. In 1969, President Richard Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, or the NEPA, which established a framework for federal agencies to consider environmental impacts in their decision-making process. The NEPA requires agencies to assess the environmental effects of proposed projects, such as infrastructure development or resource extraction, and involve the public in the decision-making process through environmental impact assessment and public hearings. This was followed by the creation of the EPA in 1970, which facilitated landmark regulations like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, establishing comprehensive frameworks for regulating air and water pollution in the United States. They set standards for pollution levels, mandated pollution control measures, and empowered the EPA to enforce regulations, ultimately leading to significant improvements in air and water quality nationwide. Additionally, the first ever Earth Day broadcast was hosted by Walter Cronkite on April 22, 1970, motivated by the growing awareness of necessary protection efforts. He begins the broadcast with his quote, "Act or die," becoming an iconic moment in the history of environmental awareness. The establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and subsequent regulatory frameworks represented pivotal milestones in addressing the environmental challenges precipitated by petroleum industrialization. Stringent standards for air and water quality, emission control, and hazardous waste management were enacted, laying the groundwork for a more sustainable future. Disasters like the Exxon Valdez oil spill pushed forward further changes to mitigate the risk of oil pollution. After the spill in 1989, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 ushered in comprehensive measures to prevent and mitigate future oil spills, while enhancing liability, response, and compensation mechanisms. Through concerted advocacy efforts, grassroots organizations and environmental advocates held governments and corporations accountable for their actions, driving policy reforms and fostering a culture of environmental stewardship. Reflecting on the legacy of petroleum's industrialization, it becomes evident that it served as a catalyst for environmental awakening in the late 20th century. From the inception of the petroleum age to the emergence of environmental movements catalyzed by disasters such as Love Canal and Exxon Valdez, the journey towards sustainability persists. I would like to thank you for joining us on this exploration of petroleum's industrialization, catalyst for environmental awakening. I'm your host, Kellen Heptich. Until next time.